excited for it. We're in the midst of what we like to call the season of list, talking season, however you want to phrase it, where we're in that holding pattern, right? Waiting for media days, waiting for fall camp, waiting for the new wave of information to come out in regards to what this football season is going to be. So this is the time of year where you get really creative. You start thinking about things, thinking about scenarios, thinking about lists. And I came across a list yesterday that, or 2 days ago now, that we've talked about quite a bit already, including myself and Preston, through a good portion of the morning. Jesse Simonton of On3, who's a national college football writer, put out his pressure check. Now, he's doing this for all conferences. He put out the Big Tens yesterday, and I'll get to that a little bit later on in the hour. But he's grouping coaches within their respective conferences on how much pressure is on them this season. And the 4 categories are extreme, high, medium, and low. And we ran through most of these yesterday. Myself and Terry Ford, obviously, again, me and Preston talked about it a little bit this morning. Last night, though, I really went through this list with a fine-tooth comb, and there's a couple of examples that Jesse Simonton gives that I don't think have the proper amount of pressure put on them. And I'll start off right at the top of the list. Well, Sam Pittman's at the top of the list. He has extreme pressure. Nobody's going to argue with that. As I mentioned, I don't think Sam Pittman makes it to the end of the year, and I love Uncle Sam. I think he's great. Fantastic personality. You know, we all love to drink beer and, hit that jukebox and all that stuff, but I just don't have confidence he's going to do enough to keep his job. He was already, we thought, fired last year. They gave him another year, but he's on thin ice. So he's the only one that got put into the extreme category, which I don't agree with, because I think Billy Napier, who is number 2 on this list, but is listed as high, also deserves to be on this list. He and Sam Pittman are the only 2 that I cannot confidently sit here and say that I think they're going to be coaching at their respective schools come season's end. Billy Napier, it's been an odd marriage down there at Florida, right? Like right from the get-go, there's always going to be excitement with any kind of new head coaching hire, but there just seemed to be this little lack of confidence from a lot of Gator fans. And then they go out there and they only go 6-6 in year 1. Okay, that's fine. It's a first year. You're rebuilding. Okay. But then you missed a bowl game last year, 5-7. Now people are like, all right, what's happening here? What's the problem? There's a lot of heightened concern with Napier down there at Florida. And it doesn't help all the off-field drama, the Jaden Rashada situation, nearly seeing his recruiting class collapse at the last minute. Like, it just seems like they're ready to push him out down there. And I'm going to be very interested to see, because they start off the year taking on Miami, a very good Miami team at that. If Florida loses that game, the panic button's getting hit immediately down there in Gainesville. Now, he's not going to get fired after week number 1, but his margin for error was already razor thin. It just got basically non-existent after that, to where however many losses they have after that will be the nail in Billy Napier's coffin, in my opinion, which is why I think he deserves to be in the extreme category. Eli Drinkwitz is on this list at 10 with the medium ranking. I think he deserves to be high. I think the amount of pressure on Eli Drinkwitz this year is legitimately high, because you have to go out there and prove that last year wasn't a fluke. Do you remember going into last season when Missouri got there or gave him his contract extension? And we all kind of had a good laugh about it, like, Eli Drinkwitz, what's he done to deserve a contract extension after going 5-5, 6-7, and 6-7 in his first 3 years at Missouri? Then they went out there and went 11-2. It's like, okay, justify the contract extension, certainly, but now you got to go out there and prove to the rest of the college football world that wasn't a fluke. You have the benefit. You're returning some pretty good talent, namely in Luther Burden, who's probably the best wide receiver in all of college football this season. You get Brady Cook back at quarterback, who's very, very underrated. I mean, he's somebody that's popping up on, Heisman list at this point in time. Not saying he's going to be in New York by any means, but a very, very serviceable and very solid quarterback. And then you lose Cody Schrader, but you bring in a pretty good tandem in Nate Noel from App State and Marcus Carroll from Georgia State. Now I know you look at Group of 5 and say, oh, how good can those guys be? They tore it up down there in Group of 5. That should be a pretty decent 1-2 combination when it comes to the backfield there. So you got all the pieces. Defense returns a lot of guys as well. The pieces are there. And I think that puts that much more pressure on Eli Drinkwitz to go out there and say, hey, this is legit. Missouri's a program and a team that you have to worry about now. We weren't just a one-year flash in the pan where, we're going to be looking back and saying, hey, remember that time Missouri won the Cotton Bowl against Ohio State? That was weird, wasn't it? No. They want to go out there and prove that they are the real deal. Mark Stoops gets put in the medium category. I drop it at low, to be completely honest with you. Mark Stoops never has a lot of pressure on him at Kentucky, if we're being honest. The bar is never that high. We joke about, football is just something that Kentucky fans do until basketball starts. And we say that in a joking way, but it's kind of true because once Big Blue Nation takes to the hardwood, football's forgotten about for the most part. And as long as you're above 500 and you're making a bowl game somewhere down in Florida or whatever, then you're in good shape. And you look at his tenure there, had 2 10-win seasons in 2018, 2021, but outside of that, 7-6 mainly, 5-6 in 2020, 8-5 in 2019. Okay, but he's just a very average coach, and that's okay. He's getting paid handsomely at Kentucky to be a very average coach, to where I don't think there's any higher expectations than that for him up there. Would they love to win? Sure. But are they getting ready to fire him this year if they go 7-6 again? No. Make your bowl game. Win enough games. You're fine. I think he's got the best deal out of anybody in the SEC given what he's accomplished up to this point. Brent Venables at Oklahoma is put in the category of medium, put in the category of low. I upgraded him to medium. I think, especially given the fact that you just got a contract extension, I think you got to go out there and prove your worth. Now, he's only been in Oklahoma for 2 years. And, his only 2 years as a head coach. Last year was a step in the right direction. First year, was okay, 6 wins. Last year, 10 wins. You took down Texas, your bitter rival and the team that went to the college football playoff. Your expectations are not as high going into the SEC as people are placing on the backs of Texas, but I'd say they're still pretty decent. You should, if you're Oklahoma, expect to probably be around that 8 to 9-ish win mark, if we're being realistic here. Is that possible? We'll see. They're replacing a lot. Dylan Gabriel's gone. Jackson Arnold coming in at quarterback, rebuilding the entire offensive line. There's a lot of question marks about this team. And yes, you're coming into a much tougher league. So I'm not going to sit here and say people should be expecting them to win 10 games to be in the college football playoff, but I don't think people are expecting them to have a steep drop-off either. And I think that places a fair amount of pressure on the back of Brent Venables in what is a prove-it type of year to me. And then Mike Elko at Texas A&M, he's actually dead last on this list, according to Jesse Simonton. They listed him as low pressure as well. I also disagree. I think that just what you have at Texas A&M in terms of resources automatically raises your expectations. Now, Jeff Lebby is above him in the low category. Jeff Lebby's expectations are very low in year one at Mississippi State, because Mississippi State does not have near the resources or near the ability that a place like A&M has to make things happen fast. And here's the thing. Jimbo Fisher did not get fired at Texas A&M because he was a terrible football coach. Jimbo Fisher is a perfectly fine football coach, but he was not achieving to the level that Texas A&M expected him to, given what they gave him, not only in money but in resources and talent as well. Mike Elko is not going to come in and have to be expected to win 9 or 10 games, but I do think there's a reasonable expectations that, hey, don't be worse than 7-5. You know what I mean? Which that's hard. That's not an easy thing to do. But I feel like, given the fact the cupboard's not completely bare, you get Connor Wakeman coming back, who's going to be one of the better regarded quarterbacks in all of college football this year. I think that places a decent amount of expectations on the shoulder of Mike Elko in year number 1. Now, it's going to be a process. Again, you did lose a lot of talent, especially on defense, this past offseason. So it's going to take a while to establish yourself, if you're going to be, as a legitimate threat in the SEC. But I don't think he can just get away with going, well, it was year number 1. They went 3-9. No, they're going to be expecting a little bit more out of you out there in College Station, especially the toughest environment to play in college football, according to EA Sports. But that's a different conversation that we've already had there. So it's an interesting look. And again, this is a subjective list. Everybody's free to have their own opinions on it. That's just kind of my thoughts of coaches that I think deserve to be in a different grouping when it came to the amount of pressure that I think is going to be on them this upcoming season. We'll get into the pressure checks of the Big Ten a little bit later on, because there's some interesting names and categories on that list as well. But it is a big weekend in racing coming up in the streets of Chicago. Chicago Street Race. Our own Jen Jensen will be there. We'll talk to her coming up next, get her preview from that, as well as look back on the weekend that was at Nashville Superspeedway. It's coming up. It is The Extra Point. Tyler Head along with you on your Monday. Not Monday, it's Wednesday. 4th of July Eve here on The Game.
One more chance. Through 3 and 4 for the final time. He goes up the racetrack. Logano goes up to block. Off turn 4. Logano is going to win in Nashville.
Welcome back in. It is the Extra Point. Tyler Head along with you here on this Wednesday. That was the call on NBC late on Sunday evening after some rain pushed through. But Joey Logano picking up the win in the Ally 400 at the Nashville Superspeedway. Here to talk racing with me, as she does each and every week, is Jen Jensen. And Jen, I was getting a little bit worried watching the race that they were not going to be done with it by the time we had our segment on Wednesday because of all the overtimes they had.
Oh my gosh! What, 5 overtimes and 31 extra laps? I just felt like if I was in the car, I would constantly be saying, "Come on!" every time a yellow would come out. You know, you just get going and then boom.
It's kind of funny because a lot of the times when we have multiple overtime restarts, it's just from, you know, guys being stupid and making mistakes and all that kind of stuff. This was kind of a mix of like guys running out of fuel and guys just racing really hard, like, you know, Larson getting into Chastain on one of those restarts by just clipping the apron there. Like, I don't think this was like a clown show type of thing. I just think it kind of devolved into having so many overtimes because of all the scenarios that were playing out there at the end.
And just fascinating, and just another testament to the fact that how they run so tight on fuel windows and things like that to really make this work. I mean, Blaney, I don't know if he's going to have a conversation with his crew chief or not. It seems like, boy, they just can't quite nail that. And it was a nerve-wracking strategy, and even without the overtimes, I mean, it just didn't work. But luckily, with all of the overtimes, he had a chance to go from one lap down to finishing 6th.
Yeah, and I think it's funny that I still can't figure out how in the world Joey Logano managed to save all that fuel, because when you add in because the fuel window is roughly 70-ish laps, you add in all those caution laps, which do help you save fuel, he still had to stretch it like 110 laps, which is completely unheard of. And cars that pitted with him in that same cycle, you know, Hamlin, guys like that, they all ran out well before the end of the race, and he still had enough to do a burnout at the end.
Right. He is the master of that. He really is good at saving fuel, but you just wonder, what has he figured out that others have not? Because that was insane, the amount of extra fuel that he was able to save.
And it's one of those things where Logano's been around for so long, and look, he hasn't had the fastest cars this year, so I don't know, maybe he was running 80% throttle for a lot of that run and just allowed him to save a lot of fuel, but he is definitely, a veteran, and put that on full display on Sunday and won a race for a guy that coming in was flirting on the cut line. He was in danger of not making the playoffs after watching his two teammates win races in the past couple weeks. And now Penske, it's so funny. Like, we went in to the month of June, like, man, Penske, I don't know. They've all 3 won races, and they're the first team to lock every single driver into the playoffs this year.
Mm-hmm. No, it's been definitely a good time for Penske. And Logano, he's just had a really kind of a bumpy season. So the fact to see him pull this out, there's got to be some kind of momentum for that team.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, that's a team that, I don't think anybody had them as a favorite to win the championship a couple seasons ago, but they started winning races at the right time and obviously walked away with the second title. So it's like, man, if this team really starts to heat up, especially as we get into the playoffs, they are always going to be dangerous because, one, Joe Logano is an incredible driver, but he and Paul Wolfe have been a very good crew chief combination together.
Yeah, they really have. And again, you weren't necessarily going to count them out, but I like you said, I don't know, do they make it all the way through the playoffs? I'm just not sure that they're a championship contender team, but they are a strong, dynamic duo. So playoff time, it's a whole funky new business. Absolutely.
And that brings us up to 11 winners as we get closer and closer to the start of the playoffs. Again, I don't see us getting to 16, but when you look at, the Martin Truex Jr.'s, the Kyle Busch's, the Bubba Wallace's, Ty Gibbs, there's a realistic chance we could still have a handful of more winners before we get into the cutoff here in a couple weeks.
I agree. And Kyle Busch, truly, because I
think he's miserable.
He's got to be. He's got to be because, he had a better season last year. I was like, okay, this is looking pretty good. And it's just been, I don't know if he needs to start hanging horseshoes in the car and, wrap his foot in his pocket because he just can't seem to catch a break.
No, he can. And look, they're making internal changes over there at RCR. Andy Petrie retired last week. Keith Rodden moved over to the director of competition, which I don't have a lot of faith in that move, but it just doesn't seem like they can really hit on anything. And if they're not having a bad race overall, because he was sitting there fourth on one of those late restarts, he ends up getting caught up in a wreck. And, they just can't really catch a break even on some of their better days.
And at his point in his career, does he entertain a team change? Is this time, like, you just kind of wonder what is going through his mind at this point as far as finishing out his career?
Who knows? But we now move on to the event that I know you've been excited about all year long, that being Chicago Street Race Version 2. And thankfully, it does not look like weather's going to be a factor this year.
No, it does not. It looks like it's going to be pretty nice, maybe mid-80s. So welcoming that, because last year destroyed a pair of shoes, which, it's tragic. And then, other people are impacted too. But all that rain, it made it so a lot of the events that were happening, throughout the weekend, those all had to be canceled. So it's going to be fun to actually be able to experience the weekend for all of the fans and not have to worry about all of the flooding that had happened, and actually get in the race, get it in a decent time where we're not praying that it's going to get too dark to be able to finish.
Well, and this year they cut about 55 miles off the length of the race as well. Last year it was scheduled for 220 miles, only went 171. This year only 165. So it's going to be something that we don't see a lot of in the Cup Series, just a very short sprint type of race.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. We're set up in just as they go into turn 2, and that's where we were last year, and thought that perspective was really good and kind of a fun spot to see them coming out of 1 and into 2. So lots of action there. But overall, I'm looking forward to the racing. I'm interested in seeing, Shane Van Gisbergen, obviously very talented. He's won in Xfinity. He won that race last year. Will he be able to win it 2 times in a row, or was that sort of a flash for him?
I feel like, and I think Chase Elliott made the comments last year that SVG is going to go back over to Australia and tell everybody that we suck over here, because I think there's a lot of frustration from the regular Cup Series drivers that this outsider came in and showed them up in their own game. I think everybody's going to be even more determined this year to kind of put him in his place and say, hey, buddy, it's not going to be that easy.
Yep. No, I agree. And that's the reason that, and as far as our picks contest in the morning show, I did not take him, and I don't think anyone else did, because I agree. I think everybody's going to be a little more prepared and a little more maybe on their A game. Not that they weren't before, but yeah, you can't have this offseason coming in and, stirring things up like that.
Well, and I think the fact that it's going to be drier conditions will maybe even it out a little bit, because Van Gisbergen just had a ton of experience driving in wet conditions a season ago, which are in his career in V8 Supercars, which I think have helped him out a year ago. So I'm very interested to see how he fares, which we've seen him run well at road course races outside of that as well. But interested to see what happens with everybody being on equal stuff in the dry conditions.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that's a very good point about the fact that he has had a lot more experience on the wets as opposed to, the drier conditions. So I'm looking forward to it. I think it's going to be a lot of fun flying out tomorrow to head to it.
Well, we'll let you get to that. Stay safe, and thankfully you're going to be able to stay dry this year. And I hope we're talking about a even more exciting race than we saw a season ago, given the fact that it won't be a monsoon this time.
Absolutely. I really am. I'm looking forward to it. So I hope everybody has a safe 4th.
Absolutely. That's Jen Jensen joining me, as she always does each and every Wednesday. Talk a little bit of racing. Coming up the next hour, I'll re-rack the conversation that myself and Shams Shapiro had yesterday with Kurt Becker from MRN, as he gave a little bit of insight from his perspective on this weekend's Chicago Street Race as well. So again, that'll come up in the 10 o'clock hour. Up next, we will dive back in to pressure rankings on head coaches. We'll take a look at the Big Ten. What does Jesse Simonton think of Big Ten coaches and who has the most pressure and who has the least? We'll dive into that coming up. It is the Extra Point. It's our head along with you on your Wednesday on the Game. Welcome back in. Is the Extra Point. Tyler Head along with you here on your Wednesday. Appreciate our friends as always over at Georgia Pacific for our Talking Hardwood segment. And we're talking about pressure on head coaches today. Kind of ran through the the SEC a little bit earlier, and some names on the list that I feel like should have been in different places, should have had different amounts of pressure applied to them. By the way, I think Shane Beamer being at 5 with a high amount of pressure placed on him is pretty fair. Now, that doesn't mean he's on the hot seat, but I think there is a fair amount of expectation that, okay, you need to take a step forward back in the right direction, get over that hump, get back to a bowl game, that kind of thing, to lessen that pressure going into next year, because I feel comfortable saying that if South Carolina does not end up making the postseason this year, Beamer likely could end up in that extreme pressure situation going in to next season. But that being said, that's the SEC. Jesse Simonton, who again is writing these for all 4 of the power conferences, put out his list of the Big Ten yesterday. And again, the Big Ten is, by the way, at 18 schools, which I'll get to the size of conferences here coming up in a little bit, because I have some interesting thoughts on that. But we're not going to run through every single name on this list, because I don't know how many people here care that much about what's happening with Purdue or Minnesota football. But I did think the way that he categorized some of these was very intriguing. And I'll start off with Ryan Day, who's at number 1 on his list of pressure here. And he puts them in the extreme category. And I agree with that. This is the year you got to get over the Michigan hump. Now let's think back to a couple years ago. Ryan Day had Ohio State in the national championship game before they lost to Alabama. That was COVID year, which is weird. But at that point in time, they were about ready to run Jim Harbaugh out of town because he couldn't get over the Ohio State hump. He'd come close, but he was not able to beat them. Well, then you go to the next season, and guess what? Michigan starts winning the game against Ohio State every single year, and has won it every single year since, en route to a couple of college football playoff appearances, and then most recently, of course, the national championship. So Michigan's become this hurdle in Ohio State's way, where they've not been able to get over the hump. And now that Michigan's won the national championship, that increases the intensity of the pressure on Ryan Day even more. But at the same time, Michigan also loses a lot of what made it so great a season ago. And I'll get to their expectations and stuff in a minute, but just know that they're not expected to be as good of a team this upcoming year. That being said, if Ohio State loses to Michigan once again, I don't know what the belief in the fan base is going to be in Ryan Day, which is a weird thing to say. This is a guy that, again, has made multiple trips to the college football playoff, has played for a national championship, is routinely winning 11 games a year. But if you can't get past your rival, especially after their head coach has gone back to the NFL, then I'm not going to say they're going to fire him. That's not going to happen. But it's just like, what are you going to do? Now, that's still good enough to make the college football playoff, but that rivalry is so important to them. If you continue on this streak of losing to Michigan, that impatience is just going to continue to grow. Now, they've got a good, strong roster going into this year. You know, the quarterback play a season ago was not where they wanted it to be. Kyle McCord was okay. He was certainly no C.J. Stroud. So they went out there and they got Will Howard to transfer in from Kansas State. They got, Travion Henderson coming back in the backfield. Quinshon Judkins transferring in from the Ole Miss, one of the best running backs in the SEC. They got a ton of guys on defense returning. Like, this should be a really, really good team. But you got to be the best team in the Big Ten. Because there's no reason anybody should be better than you if you're Ohio State at this point in time. And again, I think that's the pressure that's put on Ryan Day's back, is being that best team again and not wanting to, play second fiddle to anyone. Once again, you're still good enough to get in the playoff even if you only win 11 games. But again, you should be set up to be even better than that. And I think that's why all that amount of pressure is going to be on Ryan Day's, shoulders for this, for the season. Behind him, the number 2 spot listed in the high category, Lincoln Riley out there at Southern Cal. Yes, we got to get used to saying that Southern Cal is indeed in the Big Ten now. I know that's going to take a little bit of time. And it's funny because there's a lot of belief that Lincoln Riley never wanted to deal with the Big Ten or the SEC. Joe Castiglione, the athletic director at Oklahoma, even took a jab at him the other day, saying, hey, all these coaches that we have want to be part of the SEC, and those that don't aren't here anymore. As there's belief that when it was revealed Oklahoma was going to be heading to the SEC, that maybe Lincoln Riley didn't want any part of that, so he skipped town. Now, he went to Southern Cal prior to them being announced in the Big Ten, so I don't know what his thoughts on that were. Regardless, he's there, and now he's having to take on the Big Ten. And last year was embarrassing. Like there's no two ways about it. Last year, I think Lincoln Riley embarrassed himself as a head coach and embarrassed Southern Cal as a program. This was a team that had the defending Heisman Trophy winner, had everything you could ever want on offense to be successful, and their defense couldn't stop a nosebleed. Like, we've always known Lincoln Riley didn't really care about defense all that much in his time in Oklahoma because, all right, I'm going to score 65 points. As long as we hold the opposition to 64, we'll be fine. It really came back and bit him last year because that defense was offensively bad to where it got a lot of fingers pointed at him like, buddy, if you're going to the Big Ten, you got to clean this up because you're going to get eaten alive if you don't. And I think that's where most of the pressure lies on him this year is the fact that he said it in the offseason, we're addressing defense. They went across town. They got D'Anton Lynn from UCLA, who's coincidentally also joining, the Big Ten this upcoming year. Said, we're going to focus on defense. But that unit is in such disarray, it's not going to flip in 1 year. You're not going to go from statistically being one of the worst defenses in all of college football to suddenly being top 20. They can make improvements. They can crack the top 100, maybe top 70 or something like that. It's still probably not going to be all that great in year number 1. And that shouldn't go on D'Anton Lynn. It's a work in progress. Like, it's going to take some time. But that being said, I don't know how many wins that nets you in the Big Ten if you can't play good defense because that is a league built on strong, hard-nosed defense. On the flip side of things, on offense, he's also breaking in Miller Moss. Guy that's been sitting on the bench for a couple years. Highly touted, 4-star guy. But he's a blank canvas. You've had this run of Heisman Trophy winners and top draft picks and all that stuff. Now you got this guy that we don't know a whole lot about. What can Lincoln Riley do with him? If he's the true quarterback whisperer, he can take this guy and turn him into a superstar. We'll see what happens. A lot of pressure on Lincoln Riley. After that, you got James Franklin in the 3rd spot at Penn State. Again, I think that's very fair. He's entering year 11 at Penn State, and really, he's had Penn State as the best program in the Big Ten, not named Ohio State or Michigan. That is the one knock on him, is he cannot take down those big dogs. They've perennially been like the 3rd best team every single year. The window to get past Michigan, though, is this year. Because, again, it seems like they're going to take a step back. So, you don't have to be the best team in the conference, but if you can show that you're number 2, maybe you play Ohio State in the Big Ten championship game, that's a big step in the right direction. And I think with what we know of the college football playoff 12-team format now, I think you got a lot of people in Happy Valley expecting this team to be in the playoff. Like, hey, we can win 10 games a year. We should be in. Anything less than that's going to be unacceptable. The question is Drew Aller going to be better? He couldn't throw downfield to save his life a season ago. And as we saw, when you played good teams like Michigan and Ohio State, that comes back to bite you. Can you get better? Can you improve on that this year? We'll have to see. But James Franklin, he's a good coach. Very solid coach. And at a lot of places, what he's done so far at Penn State will get him statues built. But that's a place with even higher expectations. They're like, okay, Winning 10 games is fun. When are you going to take us to that next level? When are you going to get us in the college football playoff? When are you going to make us a serious threat for the national championship? And I think given the fact that they have the ability to make the playoff this year with the expanded field, I think that puts even more pressure squarely on his shoulders going into this season. So again, that's your top three: Ryan Day, Lincoln Riley, and James Franklin in terms of the Big Ten as far as pressure on head coaches. There's a couple, like on the SEC list, that I think are categorized in the wrong place. And as we wrap up hour number one, I will fix, in my opinion, where these guys should be in terms of the pressure that I think is going to be going on their shoulders in 2024. Reminder, as always, you can check us out on the Game TV, sponsored by our friends at Shepherd's Glass and powered by Integrated Media. You can watch us all day long, all of our shows here on the Game. More Big Ten pressure on head coaches coming up as the Extra Point rolls along on your Wednesday on the Game. Welcome back in. Extra Point. Towerhead with you here on your Wednesday, 4th of July Eve. Continuing to go through Jesse Simonton's list of pressure check on coaches in the Big Ten. Kind of ran through the names at the top of the list. Again, Ryan Day is the only one in the extreme category. Lincoln Riley and James Franklin both falling into the high category, which I think is fair. But like the list for the SEC, I feel like there's a couple coaches that have been miscategorized a little bit here. And I'll go down to number 5. Sharon Moore, taking over as the head coach at Michigan, is listed with medium pressure. I very much disagree with that. I think Sharon Moore definitely faces high pressure here. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, I'm not expecting a whole lot out of Michigan this year. I understand what they're replacing. I understand the difference between Jim Harbaugh as the head coach and Sharon Moore as the head coach. But if you're Sharon Moore, you have the pressure from your own fan base to prove that you can be the guy to keep this thing on track. Jim Harbaugh is one of the best football minds there is out there. And he finally won a national championship, but now he's gone. Can you, as Sharon Moore, keep this thing on the track? Nobody's expecting them to be undefeated, but can you get them back to the playoff? Can you get them in that realm of competing at the end of the season for the regular season, for the Big Ten championship? I think that's where the expectations are. And again, you're replacing the quarterback. You're replacing your running back, 3 of your top 4 wide receivers, the offensive line. Like, you got a lot of things to figure out. But I don't think that makes it acceptable to suddenly go 7-5. You know what I mean? There's a lot of expectations on Sharon Moore's back to prove to people that the good times aren't over. That, hey, I know Jim Harbaugh's gone, but we still have something good here going at Michigan that we're going to continue to have going forward. Kurt Ferentz at Iowa, also listed in the medium category. I'm going to upgrade him to high as well. Quite frankly, if I'm an Iowa fan, I'm embarrassed by not only what I've saw last year, but what I've seen in the long history of Iowa football when it comes to offense. You had a defense and a special teams unit that was about second to none. That if you had any kind of semblance on offense, we could have been talking about Iowa's national championship threat. But instead, everybody looked at what they were doing with Brian Ferentz being the offensive coordinator and laughing. You, as Brian Ferentz, you cratered a potential championship-level team for nepotism, for wanting your own son to continue to be your offensive coordinator. Well, finally, they got Brian Ferentz out of the way, but he went out and hired Tim Lester as the offensive coordinator. Now, Tim Lester's been a head coach, but let's go back to the last time he was calling plays in college at Syracuse a decade ago. His offenses in 2 seasons, respectively, ended up 99th and 121st in scoring offense. Doesn't seem like that big of a difference to me. I think the amount of pressure on Kurt Ferentz's back is immense. And look, he's been there forever. I don't think anybody wants to run him out of town, but if you once again prove that your offense can't play in the 21st century, I think that seat will start to get a little bit hot. Because, again, we know the defense is going to be good. We know special teams is going to be good. Just play some offense. Line up in the shotgun. Throw a deep ball, something. Give these fans something to hope for. Because you haven't done that in a very, very long time. And again, you're wasting historical talent on the other sides of the ball by just refusing to adapt into the 21st century when it comes to offense. So and here's the thing. Even if you won 10 games, like they were 10-4 last year. If Iowa wins 10 games again this year, the way that they did last year with an inept offense, I don't even know if the committee puts them in. Because I don't know if the committee would say, we think they're one of the best teams because of how ineffective they were on offense. Something to think about. A lot of pressure on the back of Kurt Ferentz. And lastly, Dan Lanning at Oregon. Yes, Oregon is in the Big Ten now. Get used to saying that as well. He also got listed as medium, which I think is very incorrect. I put him in the high category as well. From the standpoint of there's mega high expectations being put on that program in year number 1 in the Big Ten. Terry and I talked about this the other day. There are people already penciling them in for that trip to Indianapolis and being in the college football playoff. They certainly have the talent to do that, but you got to go out there and do it. And Dan Lanning, defensive-minded coach, coached in the SEC under Kirby, learned from the Nick Saban coaching tree the whole 9 yards. He understands the grind of a tough conference and a tough schedule. But you got to go out there and do it now in the Big Ten, which is not going to be easy. And they may come out of the gate strong, but they might falter down the stretch towards the middle to late part of the season if that grind gets a little bit too much for them. So I think there's the pressure on the back of Dan Lanning as the head coach to prove that they belong in the Big Ten. Because everybody looks at them and really all these West Coast teams, they're flashy, up-tempo offenses. And outside of Utah, who's going to the Big 12, not the most hard-nosed defenses in the world. So if I'm Dan Lanning, I feel an immense amount of pressure on my shoulders to go in there and prove what I've built so far in just a short time at Oregon is not only good, but legitimate enough to compete in one of the toughest two conferences in all of college football in the Big Ten. And look, if they got to Indianapolis in December, I'm not going to be surprised by it. It's not going to be easy, but they have the capability to do it. And I think that, again, puts a lot of pressure on the back of Dan Lanning to go out there and make that happen in year number one, especially with Michigan kind of seemingly stepping to the side by losing what they lost. That second spot beside Ohio State, wide open. And a lot of people think that Oregon can be the team to go in there and fill that void and maybe make a run at the college football playoff in year number one in the Big Ten. So, again, that's Jesse Simonton's list of pressure checks for Big Ten head coaches. We'll next week dive into some of his thoughts on the Big 12 and the ACC as well. Coming up in hour number 2, the latest on the Florida State versus ACC, as well as the Clemson versus ACC saga, and what's coming next. That's all coming up hour number 2. It is The Extra Point. Tyler Head along with you on this Wednesday on The Game. Oh, it's not only a holiday weekend, it's a busy sports weekend, and I can't think of any better place to take in all the action than with our friends over at Twin Peaks. Starting tomorrow, running through the weekend, you have the John Deere Classic. You can consider Twin Peaks your 19th hole all weekend. The John Deere Classic teeing off tomorrow, July the 4th at TPC Deere Run up in Illinois. Then coming up on the 6th, which is Saturday, you have pay-per-view boxing, last man standing, Nate Diaz versus Masvidal. The BMF title rematch between Diaz and Masvidal is on, but this time they'll be meeting in the boxing ring. Classic scenic views of every second with those 29-degree draft beers in hand with your friends over at Twin Peaks. Can't think of a better place to park yourself for the 4th of July holiday weekend than with our friends over at Twin Peaks down in the Vista. Welcome back in. It is the Extra Point, hour number 2. Tyler Head along with you here on The Game. Remind you, coming up at 10:30, we'll react to the conversation we had yesterday with Motor Racing Network's Kurt Becker as we get set for this weekend's Chicago Street Race for the NASCAR Cup Series. Second time they've run this race. Thankfully, this year it's going to be a lot more dry than than last year's was. Yesterday, we started talking about this in the 11 o'clock hour because we didn't get the report on this until later on yesterday morning about South Carolina and Clemson potentially getting the chance to play on Black Friday this year as the ACC and ESPN approached Clemson with this idea because they are, of course, the home team, for this year's Palmetto Bowl. And Clemson basically said, yeah, kick rocks, we're not going to do that. And it was interesting. We were kind of, going through reasons why. A lot of you waited on the Firehouse Subs text line as well. Like, well, Clemson doesn't like to play home games on the week. Dabo doesn't like to interfere with high school football. And I don't think this got as far as Dabo before it was said no. I think it really boils down to this standoff that Clemson's having with the ACC in regards to wanting to get out. So the fact that they were approached by the ACC with something that they probably felt could help the conference, Clemson's like, no, to heck with you. We don't want to do that. We're going to stick with what we already have, which, again, kind of boils down to the rift between those two. And the reason that we found out about this information is because of court documents, because the ACC is in court. They were yesterday in Mecklenburg County up there in North Carolina, trying to hammer things out with the ACC in terms of, where this is going to take place and all that kind of stuff. But it all boils down to, at the end of the day, Clemson wanting to get out of the ACC's grant of rights. Florida State's also in that boat as well. Now, there have been a lot of schools, the Virginia schools, North Carolina schools, that have all voiced displeasure with the ACC, wanting to get more money. Because at the end of the day, this is what this all boils down to. It's money. Everything in college football, everything in college sports in general is all driven by money. That's why we have two teams in California playing in the ACC now, because of money or lack thereof that they were going to get in the Pac-12. And Florida State and the ACC look at what they perceive to be the value that they bring to the Atlantic Coast Conference and think they're not getting compensated well enough for that. And as we've talked about many times, there's an ironclad grants of rights deal locked in through 2036 between the ACC and the ESPN that doesn't allow any wiggle room for these teams to leave the conference based on the way that it's written. Now, they are exploring those opportunities to get out of that grant of rights, if at all possible. But it's kind of one of those things that I'll believe when I see. As I brought up many times, and this is the solid argument in court, you signed this. You wanted the ACC network so bad, you were willing to lock in your media rights for the next 20 years back in 2016 just to make sure you could have a network, which is why we're in this situation now. And again, at that point in time, the money they were getting was solid, but they've watched the SEC and the Big Ten run away with the annual revenue that they're going to be generating with their new television deals. And again, the ACC sitting there unable to move and unable to wiggle for anything else because they're already locked in to the contract that they have. And as I've said, I'll believe it when I see it in terms of either one of these teams or anybody getting out of the ACC. However, there does seem to be a little smoke to something potentially happening on the horizon with Florida State. Let's go with cut number 2 from today's list here, Dave. This is Josh Pate of the Late Kick Podcast. Maybe dropping some hints on what could be coming down the pipeline sooner rather than later with Florida State.
The decision makers involved in when that's going to happen are of this world. This world, meaning they don't wear a whistle around their neck. They understand marketing, strategy, promotion, dollars and cents, of course, but they understand there is a picture here much bigger than just Doak Campbell Stadium or Clemson or Florida State or fill in the blank. They understand that there's a whole bigger world. There's a world with several zeros on the end of it. That's what this really all centers around.
And he goes on to say that he believes something is coming soon. And I say, oh, that's just speculation. He's very well connected. And typically when he says things, they usually end up happening. So if nothing else, it should raise your eyebrow. Like, what is going to be coming on the horizon? And there's a very important date on the horizon when it comes to future movement, that being August 15th. Because if Florida State does intend to play college football in a different conference in 2025, they must inform the ACC by August 15th, which that just makes sense in general, as we saw with the collapse of the Pac-12 and everything. You got to have these things set in stone at least a year out for scheduling purposes, for all that kind of stuff, for the eventual transition over into the new conference. So they got a little over a month to do whatever they're going to do to get themselves out of the ACC. Now, again, that comes with a very hefty price tag as well if they're going to do it. But, as I mentioned, Florida State and Clemson view themselves as underpaid and undervalued based on where they currently sit in the ACC. Don't believe me? You want to hear it from the horse's mouth? Well, let's go to cut number 1 from today's list. This is the Florida State Board of Trustees Chair, Peter Collins, talking this week about what he believes Florida State's worth and value is within the Atlantic Coast Conference.
Look, at the end of the day, we are worth more than we are getting paid. A lot more than we are getting paid. And I think for every Seminole, they get upset about that. And I would challenge anybody to tell me that we're not, to tell me that we're worth the same amount as some of the other schools in the conference from a media standpoint. And really, at the end of the day, it's the networks that drive the value. And the value will be a lot less, I think, per team if there were some teams to leave the ACC. It would just, it would be. I think by our underpayment, they're getting overpaid. How's that?
And I don't think he's necessarily wrong. And we'll look at this purely from a college football standpoint because that's what generates more revenue than anything else. But Florida State and Clemson are bigger values to the ACC in football than Syracuse and Boston College. And are they probably handcuffed by the ACC and the grand rights deal? Yeah, absolutely, which is why they're trying their hardest to get out. Now, the ACC, understanding the frustration of schools like them, did implement their success incentives last year, which basically, if a team like Florida State, funny enough, would have made the college football playoff, they would have gotten an extra chunk of dough that would have just been theirs. So traditionally, whenever a team makes a college football playoff or whatever it may be, that money is distributed out throughout the entire conference. Well, this success initiative would just pay the direct school that accomplished this instead of the entire conference. So that also adds to the frustration of why Florida State, got left out of the playoff last year, because that would have meant more money in their pocket. Now, that doesn't equal up to what SEC and Big Ten schools are making, but it's still something. So, again, more frustration for not making the college football playoff last year. But even this, with the success initiatives, even if, Florida State made every college football playoff for the next 10 years, they're still going to be really far behind their counterparts in the SEC and the Big Ten, which, again, is why they're trying their hardest to get out. As we brought up, I wouldn't think Florida State would be trying to make these moves if they didn't know they had a landing spot. They're not going to jump out of the bird's nest without knowing they can fly. You know what I mean? And Greg Sankey has been very vocal that they are not looking to expand the SEC anytime soon. So I'd cross that one off the list there. The Big 12 has the potential to make more money than the ACC. Their media deal is more short-term and can be improved upon before 2036. So the upside potential of the Big 12 is higher than the ACC, but it's not leaps and bounds better than what they're getting as of right now. So the Big 10 seems to be like the only plausible scenario for them. I don't know. The Big Ten is an 18-team league as of right now. They weren't planning to be an 18-team league. They took on Southern Cal and UCLA as full members, or announced them to be full members 2 seasons ago in the summer of 2022, and they were fully intent on being a 16-team conference in 2024. Well, then the Pac-12 just kind of fell apart, and they ended up being a landing spot for Oregon and Washington as well. And now they've got this mess on their hands of an 18-team league, which I'm very intrigued to see how that works out as far as scheduling, and I'll get to some of those thoughts coming up in a minute. But the interesting thing to me about this is the money allocation for Oregon and Washington. Because, again, the Big Ten only intended to bring in Southern Cal and UCLA, and they're bringing them in as full members. They'll get the full $60-ish million payout every single year as full members of the Big Ten. Given the fact that Oregon and Washington were late additions, they're coming in as half members. Now, they're going to compete in every sport, but the revenue that they're going to get, around $30 million, at least to start out. It will increase as time goes on because they've been able to work that out. But they're not coming in getting the full allotment of the Big Ten money right out of the gate, which for schools that were in the Pac-12 last year, and the Pac-12 was going to give them nothing because they couldn't figure out a TV deal, that's fine. But when you're talking about Florida State, who's trying to escape the ACC, making that $30-ish to $40-ish million range, I just don't know if the Big Ten has the money for it. I don't know if they can guarantee, like, yeah, come on up here. We can set aside another $30 million for however many years, eventually up to $60 million to guarantee you a spot in this league. I just don't know if that works out. I don't know if the money math is there. Again, if I'm Florida State, I'm not jumping out of the nest without knowing I have a landing spot. But it just the math to me is interesting, and I don't know if the Big Ten has that for what FSU is going to want to join them. So we'll see. It's very interesting. But as I mentioned, again, the smoke's out there. Something's happening. Something is brewing down there in Tallahassee. And if they're going to get out, they've got a month and 12 days to do it. Because August 15th is that deadline to tell the ACC, hey, guess what? This is our last year in the league. We're going elsewhere in 2025. Again, I'll believe it when I see it. Because from everything that I've heard about that grant of rights, it is as ironclad can be. And I, quite frankly, don't know how Florida State will get out of it, but they're going to try their best. More power to them, to Clemson as well. If they think they can get out, if they think they can go somewhere else and find the value they're looking for as a school, then by all means go for it. I think we're all sitting back, intrigued to see how it unfolds at the end of the day. So I mentioned the Big Ten going to 18 teams. We are entering a new era of college football in terms of how big conferences are. What's the limit? And how are these leagues going to handle expanded conferences? We'll dive into that coming up. It is the Extra Point. Tyler Head along with you on your Wednesday, 4th of July Eve, here on The Game. Welcome back in. Extra Point. Tyler Head with you here on the game. Reminder, craft beer questions. $360 value. All yours for just $79. Go online to 1075game.com. Click on Sweet Deals for your chance to purchase the craft beer card. As I mentioned, in the last segment there, the SEC and Greg Sankey have been very adamant they are not looking to expand past what they're doing this year with Texas and Oklahoma anytime soon. And that kind of reinforces what we've long known about the SEC is that they're very strategic when it comes to expansion. They are not presenting themselves as just a landing spot for anybody. You have to really go through a process to join the SEC. And really in the past couple decades, they've kind of been the leader when it's come to expansion, usually doing things before anybody else. When South Carolina and Arkansas came in the early 90s, the SEC was the first in the modern era to go to 12 teams and split into divisions and have a championship game. Well, guess what? All the other conferences ended up following suit on that. In 2012, when they welcomed in Texas A&M and Missouri, first to go to 14. And soon after, all the other major conferences, with the exception of the Big 12, followed suit with that. And it looked like both the SEC and the Big 10 were getting set to kind of lead the way when it came to being the first conferences to 16 teams. Well, then the Pac-12 fell apart, and the Big 10 took on 2 more teams, and then the ACC ended up at 17 teams, and now SEC isn't necessarily leading the charge in that regard. Let's go to this cut from yesterday on our list yesterday. Here's Greg Sankey earlier on this week at the introduction of Oklahoma and Texas to the SEC, talking a little bit about the SEC being a 16-team league in 2024.
It's been a lot of work, and we've had to stay grounded in who we are. The expectation was we're growing to 16, but we need to operate a league of 14 members. We obviously have a lot happening around us. We've talked ad nauseum about legal issues or state legislative issues or congressional issues. So we've had to operate, and then we've had to prepare. I think we've done a great job preparing across the board for our sports. When we launch volleyball season, Texas plays Texas A&M in a match right off the bat. You look at our 8-team decision, but the strength of what's happening, there's an F1 car here featuring the Georgia-Texas game in October. Only place on planet Earth where there'll be a college football game at the highest level and an F1 race happening. So that's pretty cool. And you've had to prepare for those moments, had to adapt. We're still in conversation about the future. We have a football schedule for 24-25. We're looking at 26 and beyond. At this university, they've had to prepare. Our teams have to prepare for visiting new cities. Oklahoma and Texas have to prepare for visiting new places that are just wonderful places in the Southeastern Conference, but intensely competitive. And so all of that's been what's in the work and the meaning and the preparation and the planning. And, there'll be gaps or adjustments, and we'll have to adapt as we go a little bit as well.
And I think that's really smart because it brings up a good point. There's adaptation with every change that you make. And being strategic with where you add teams makes a lot of sense because, and I talk about this a lot, with any kind of change, especially in the sports landscape, there's always going to be unknowns and there's always going to be unintended consequences. And one big thing that I'm very curious about when it comes to the expansion, not just the SEC, but all these leagues, is how the standings shake out. Because remember, nobody has divisions anymore. It is truly a list of 1 to 16, if you're in the SEC, 1 to 18 in the Big 10, and so on and so forth, of determining your division standings, or your league standings, to where the top 2 teams based on win percentage will go and represent the conference at the respective conference championship game. With so many teams, especially in the SEC, with only playing 8 conference games, there exist a lot of possibilities for ties. In fact, I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole on Reddit, and there are quite a few possibilities of multiple teams ending up undefeated, 3 to 4 teams. How you break that tie, I don't know. But even outside of teams being undefeated, I was looking at this yesterday, you could realistically have a situation where, let's say Georgia goes undefeated, and then Texas and Alabama both end up at 7-1 in conference play, with both their losses going to Georgia. How do you break that tie? How do you determine which of those teams goes and plays Georgia in Atlanta for the conference championship game? And up to this point, again, we're less than 60 days away from the season starting. We don't know what the tiebreaker scenarios in the SEC are going to be. I would think that Greg Sankey at Media Days would probably address that. But you're running into a realistic possibility, not just the SEC, the Big Ten as well, because that opens up even more doors for multiple ties, not only at the top, but through various places in your league standings that are very important, especially if you're talking about making the college football playoff. Because let's say you're splitting hairs between the third and the fourth team in the Big Ten, and that decides who's going into the college football playoff and who isn't. It's going to be interesting to see. Connor O'Gara of Saturday Down South laid out a couple different plausible potential tiebreakers that we could see come into effect, specifically with the SEC. One of them he lays out is total victory versus SEC teams that finished with the winning record. Another possibility is total conference wins among teams beaten in SEC play. Now we're getting a little bit convoluted. Total scoring margin versus conference opponents. So now we're going to even more data points. Post regular season college football playoff ranking. So if you really can't decide, would you let the committee decide who plays in the SEC championship game if it came down to theoretically a Texas and Alabama? Maybe. I don't know. That is what I'm so intrigued by, is what direction is the SEC going to go. There's going to be multiple layers to this. They're not just going to have one reference for tiebreaker, but what is that first point? If you can't determine things head-to-head because there's so many possibilities of non-head-to-head teams being tied in the standings. So how do you determine that? How do you break those ties to see who maybe goes to your conference championship game and who maybe even goes to college football playoff? Again, I talk about unintended consequences in college football. This one, to me, is a really big one that I'm interested to see how the SEC decides that they are going to handle this when it's all said and done. As I mentioned, it's a big weekend in racing. Chicago Street Race coming up on Sunday. Watch it on NBC. Listen to it on the Motor Racing Network. Yesterday, myself and Sam Shapiro, we actually talked to Kurt Becker, who's going to be on the call this weekend for the Motor Racing Network up there in Chicago about the race taking place this weekend. We racked that conversation for you coming up next. It is the Extra Point. It's all right along with you here on the game. Welcome back in. Extra Point. Tyler Head along with you here on this Wednesday. As I mentioned, Chicago Street Race coming up this weekend for the NASCAR Cup Series. You'll be able to listen to it on the Motor Racing Network. Yesterday, myself and Sam Shapiro were joined for a few minutes by Kurt Becker of MRN, previewing this weekend Chicago Street Race. And we started off, thankfully, talking about the fact that weather does not seem like it's going to be an issue this weekend.
This is true, and that's a welcome sight, because last year I think they received more rain on that race weekend than Chicago normally gets for the entire month of July. It was something like 7 or 8 inches of rain, which is crazy. And by the way, I have to give you all credit. Maybe it's your producer I should credit for this. That was fantastic, having a Warren Zevon rejoin, because Warren's was from Chicago originally, and of course he's gone now. But I thought that was very apropos.
We don't do anything by accident in the radio business. I think you know that, right?
This is true.
Absolutely. We're certainly looking forward to it. And look, I've been a long time NASCAR fan, and NASCAR these past couple of years has not been afraid to step outside of its comfort zone, whether it be racing on dirt or Bristol, whether it be going to the LA Coliseum. And, looking at the Chicago Street Race a year ago, I truly did not know how it was going to go. And yes, the rain certainly threw them for a loop, but when it was all said and done and, Shane Van Gisbergen was celebrating his victory, I came away from it saying, wow, that was really cool. I can't wait to see this next year.
I will even go a step further. I live in Illinois. My home is downstate, about 3.5 hours south of Chicago. And I live out in the rural area. I live in the town where I grew up. It's a town of 2,400 people. It's agriculture based. I had lived at one time in the Chicago suburbs, and I told people, this is crazy. There's no way this is going to work. I don't know what NASCAR is thinking. And then I'm like you, even despite the rain, I could not get over that this was truly unique. The skyscrapers, that whole Chicago skyline on one side of the course, Lakeshore Drive, Lake Michigan, the Shedd Aquarium, the Field Museum on the other side, and a whole lot of people that had never been to a NASCAR race in person. I just thought it was fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, and it's so cool, seeing a race like that, come to one of the biggest cities, in America and kind of utilize, I guess, the beautiful, area and bringing that talent there. I guess, why of all the cities, Chicago being such a great place to, bring a NASCAR race like that, why is it so great for the sport?
I thought that the way it struck me, two things. I thought, as far as the world of sport is concerned, Chicago has such a rich sports tradition dating well back into the 19th century. And you've got organizations like the Cubs and the White Sox and the Bears, and then more recently the Chicago Bulls and so on. That I thought, wow, it's such a fun thing for NASCAR to add its own chapter. There had been a NASCAR Cup race or two back in the 50s at the home of the Bears at Soldier Field, but nothing in the modern era, nothing quite like this. And then the other thing I thought, fellas, was the way that here they have shut down one of the leading cities, not only in America but arguably in the world, for business and commerce. And to see a whole city of that nature and of that level of importance in our country and in the world scheme of things shut down for a couple of days and say, all right, NASCAR, you're on. We're going to give you this chance, and we'll let you know what we think. And then the way it went over, I just thought that all added up to a big win for the sport.
Again, talking to Kurt Becker from the Motor Racing Network, previewing this weekend's Chicago Street Race for the NASCAR Cup Series. One of the things that I thought was really cool watching last year's event was the people that were literally trying to peer through holes in the fence just to get a glimpse of NASCAR Cup Series cars making their way through the streets of Chicago and giving your connection to the city itself. What have you heard from the locals in terms of a response to last year's event and the anticipation for this year's event?
I can tell you a couple of things, and you absolutely described it perfectly about people walking up and peering through the fence. My turn position to do play-by-play last year was a scissor lift on Lakeshore Drive. And during one of the rain delays on Saturday of that weekend last year, I came down and I walked over to the fence that separates Lakeshore Drive from the Field Museum and the Shed Aquarium, and there were people lined up along that fence. And I went down the road and just started asking, is this your first time at a NASCAR race? And one after another, they said yes. And one of the greatest comments I heard, there was a couple standing there, and they said, look, we've noticed there's a car with flashing lights on top of it, and it only comes out there once in a while, and everybody else lines up behind it, but they won't pass it. Why? And obviously they were referring to the pace car, and I thought, what a great reminder. There are so many things those of us who are fans of the sport or who work in the sport, we just take for granted. Oh, well, everybody knows what a pace car is or what its function is. No, not everybody does. And the fact that they are willing to learn, they want to know, people were asking questions, was a great sign. And then on the other side of that question that you asked as far as this year, I actually grew up in the horse business in Illinois, the racehorse industry. I've had people that have never acknowledged, people in that business that have never acknowledged what I do with Motor Racing Network, that have told me over the last couple of months they've got tickets, they're going to the Chicago street race. I am absolutely floored by that, because that tells me they must have seen the images, heard the broadcast last year, and thought, that's a pretty neat event. I want to be part of it. So that's great to see.
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually originally from New York, and the first NASCAR experience I was kind of introduced to was about a year or two ago up at Watkins Glen International. And, seeing stuff like, this race happening in Chicago, it always makes me wonder, like what other cities across the country, like Chicago, like New York, could really, have, races like this down the future that could kind of continue to help grow the sport. And, where you're, encountering more people where it's like, oh, yeah, this is my first NASCAR race and I love this and I want to keep coming to this.
I think there's a brilliance in that strategy. And I think the brilliance is, if we want to market the sport, if we want to market the sport to new fans and draw new interest to build on our fan base, we can do one of two things. We can either do what we've done, which is go far enough away from the city that you find enough real estate to build a speedway, and then hope that people are willing to commute and leave their homes and leave the metropolitan area and drive an hour or two out to the country where the track is, or at least on occasion we can take the race to the people where they are. And I think it makes for a great balance. It's wonderful. We've got the permanent speedways where we do. I love tradition. I think our traditional fan base, we absolutely need to remember and respect that. But at the same time, if we work in the sport, if we're genuine fans of the sport, we want to take that sport, when possible, into new markets. And I think this is a great way to do it. I'm with you. I would love to see. I've heard people mention Manhattan, New York City. I've heard Denver mentioned as possible locations where, there might be some interest, but nothing official. I mean, that's just all kind of been coffee shop talk, as we say here in my little town. But I'm with you. I think it's a great concept.
And the race itself last year was obviously a huge story, but then you had Shane Van Gisbergen coming over from V8 Supercars in his first ever NASCAR start and pulling off the victory. Now he was a little bit more adept to those wet conditions than some of the guys in the Cup Series were, which may have helped him out a little bit. But as we've seen in his year in the Xfinity Series so far, dude is just an absolute monster on road courses, and he's going to be once again one of the favorites going into this weekend, in addition to guys like AJ Allmendinger, Brad Hand coming over from sports cars, as well as the usual heavy hitters on the Cup Series side, Logano, Kyle Larson, William Byron, guys like that. So a real mixed bag of who can come out on top this weekend.
Fellas, it's clear you follow the sport, and that you all do your homework. It's absolutely correct when you point out, you nailed it. Van Gisbergen benefited from two things last year. Number one, his natural talent and background on wet pavement, and then number two, the fact that he did bring those skills added to that environment with all that rain, all that you had standing water on portions of the course. Other portions were dry. And he just did such a marvelous job of navigating that. You're right. We've seen, as he spent most of his time this year in the Xfinity Series, had that win on the road course at Portland recently, has shown some flashes of brilliance on the ovals, although there's still a learning curve there. But yeah, you mentioned some of the NASCAR regulars in the lineup. If you go back and look at the video from last year's race in Chicago, Tyler Reddick was strong, Christopher Bell was strong, Kyle Larson was strong. Bell threw it into the tire barrier late. So did Tyler Reddick. Larson, for a guy that's usually so aggressive, Larson really was careful and more cautious, one might say, in that final 15, 18 laps. And he actually followed Van Gisbergen up to the front of the field. And I think with the forecast being sunny and dry, at least as it stands right now, a few days out, that if you take the rain and the wet pavement out of the equation, if I'm not saying Van Gisbergen can't come back and win again, but I think in some respects it's going to be a bigger challenge for him.
Well, we're certainly looking forward to it. And again, thankful that it seems like the rain's going to stay away this year. And hopefully we get treated to just as good of a show as we had a season ago. And want to wish you and your colleagues on the Motor Racing Network a great call this weekend as well. Appreciate your time, Kurt.
We sure appreciate the chance to come on and visit about the race. And thanks one and all for being part of the Motor Racing Network family. It means a lot to us. And everyone enjoy the race this weekend.
And again, that was a conversation with Kurt Becker from the Motor Racing Network yesterday. And again, that coming up, the Chicago Street Race this weekend. You can listen to it on MRN on our sister station, ESPN 1320 WISW. Also catch the action on NBC Sunday afternoon at 4:30. We'll come back, wrap up today's edition of the Extra Point, talk some July 4th cookout food. My favorite topic of conversation. That's next on the Extra Point here on The Game. Welcome back in. Extra Point. Tyler Head along with you here on the game. July the 3rd, which means tomorrow is Independence Day. And as many people do on Independence Day, celebrating with some good food and obviously hanging out with friends and family as well. Dave, if you're building your ideal July 4th plate, what's going to end up on it? What's your go-to for July 4th food?
Well, we're going to start with fried chicken for
okay.
sure. Yeah.
That's one that people don't bring up a lot. People kind of automatically go to like burgers and dogs, but fried chicken, that's a good pull.
Yeah, I'll take the burgers and all that, but fried chicken, man, is for me for everything.
Yeah.
I just love it. And then I think some grilled corn on the cob.
Okay, another, I'd say underrated side. People kind of get like jump on like baked beans, potato salad, those kind of things. But corn on the cob, that also, especially grilled. You like grilling corn on the cob takes it to another level. You mix it in with with the butter and the seasoning, all that kind of stuff. That's hard to beat.
Yeah. I also have to have mashed potatoes because my daughter loves mashed potatoes.
Oh, I love mashed potatoes too.
So that's got to be on there.
Yeah.
And let's see, maybe macaroni and cheese.
Okay.
I think so. I can do without the baked beans. Just don't even. That's just wasted space for me. It's taking up something. I'm not going to eat those.
Now, are you a hot dog guy?
Yeah, I like hot dogs. It's got to have chili.
Okay. Are you saddened that Joey Chestnut will not be able to defend the mustard yellow belt tomorrow at the Nathan's Famous Hot Dog Eating Contest?
Yeah, it's like a tradition. I mean, you can't do away with tradition. It just
and I think. Preston and I were looking up the odds earlier. George Esper has the best odds to win. James Webb in second. Those two guys finished second and third last year in the Nathan's Hot Dog Eating Contest. But, I feel like you're setting up whoever wins just have an asterisk because then we're like, oh, you won, but you didn't beat Joey Chestnut to do it.
Exactly, yeah.
So, and Joey Chestnut apparently is going to be doing an event in Texas where he's going to be racing, doing his own hot dog eating contest against 4 members of the military, to which he's competing with their combined total.
Wow.
So it's a 5-minute contest. I don't know if it's Nathan's Hot Dogs or just some other brand of hot dogs. Maybe not Nathan's, considering the fallout from this year's contest. But he has to beat their 4 total, which I think he can do. Like 4 guys together in 5 minutes. I don't know. Maybe they could get like 30 if they're lucky. But, I mean, considering the fact that he was touching 80 in the Nathan's contest, I think he's still going to win.
Yeah, me too.
But I was holding out hope that, maybe, because when they announced that he was not going to be in the contest a couple weeks back because of this deal that he'd done with the vegan, food company or whatever, I thought, man, there's going to be so much pushback. They're going to have to put him back in. There's no way you can keep Joey Chestnut at the Nathan's Famous Hot Dog Eating Contest, but it's gotten to this point that we obviously know he's not. But I thought, how cool would it be if, because they do the introductions, they announce all the eaters and all that kind of stuff to take their place. There's one spot in the middle. And then, I don't know, I'm a Real American, Hulk Hogan's old theme song starts blaring, and here comes Joey Chestnut. The reaction and the attention Major League Eating would get from that would be unbelievable.
It would be great. I would love that.
But guess I have to wait till next year. Yeah. But again, I'm intrigued by this year's contest from the standpoint, I think it could be a good competition to where, I feel like in years past, most years, it's all right, well, what number is Joey going to hit? It's all right, he's basically racing himself. Because you get 3-4 minutes in the contest, he's up by 12 or 15 hot dogs. You're all right, nobody's going to catch him, right? He's going to go out there and win. It's just how many hot dogs he's going to eat. So he's basically competing against himself. But now the fact that he's not there, and George Asper and James Webb were separated by 2 hot dogs last year. We could legitimately, for the first time in a while, get a neck-and-neck fight to see who's going to win this thing.
I would like that.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
It'd be entertaining. And I tried looking this up. I'm pretty sure Major League Eating has overtime rules, like sudden death, sudden dog, I don't know. We're all right, you're tied at 50 hot dogs, put 3 minutes on the clock and let's re-rack and see who has more. This could get really interesting to me.
Yeah. I still don't see how they do it, It's 2 hot dogs for me, and I'm I can't eat it.
They had that 30 for 30 on Chestnut and Kobayashi's rivalry, and like Chestnut kind of showed his technique. It's a lot of training because you have to like train your body to eat that much as well as hold that much. Like he talked about having to drink a ton of water just to like expand your stomach to get it used to holding that capacity. Because yeah, most of us, like maybe if you're really hungry, you might eat maybe even 4 and you're like, I'm done. So I can't imagine slamming 70 of those things in 10 minutes and still being able to walk.
And how does he not look like a sumo wrestler? You know, I look like a sumo wrestler.
Well,
and I can't eat that.
and that goes back to the metabolism thing too. Like you have to train your body to not only eat that much, but to burn it off too. So like you know, these guys are next level. Not anybody can get. You have to like qualify for this event in general, but nobody can just go up there and knock it out of the park right away.
We know what we should do.
What?
As a station, everybody on the station, we should go to one of those things. Like at the fair, they used to have pie eating contests, and you couldn't use your hands.
Yeah.
You just had to put your face into pies and eat them and fast it. I'd love to do that again.
I'm down with that. I feel like I'm a competitive eater at heart. I think I could do okay.
Yeah, let's call a state fair and see what we can do.
Well, Wednesday, state fair is what, October?
Yeah.
We got time. We can work that out.
Yeah, I think so.
Me and you go head to head in a eating contest.
Yeah, blueberry pie.
I'd be down for that. Yeah, let's see if we can make that happen. We got a couple months' time. We can work that out, that's for sure. But looking forward to it tomorrow on whoever ends up winning the hot dog contest. Maybe it'll be a good fight this year without Joey Chestnut there. But that'll do it for today's edition of The Extra Point. Coming up next, we'll dive into the Gamecock Central Takeover Hour presented by Firehouse Subs. Myself and just Wes Mitchell today talk a little bit about what's going on with South Carolina's coaching staff, as well as talk to our guy, Matt Brown from the Extra Points newsletter on the latest on the College Football 25 video game here coming up in the next hour on your Wednesday, 4th of July Eve here on The Game.